Every summer, my family and I travel to Canada to visit friends and family, but this year we flew via the East Coast. Our ultimate destination was Toronto and my hometown of London, which I lovingly refer to as fake London. But first, we had a stopover to see family near Montreal, which meant we needed a way to get from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Montreal, Quebec. A flight would take under 2 hours and cost a couple of €100 per person. So of course, we took the 24-hour train instead, which ended up coming in about 2.5 hours late. I should say that we took this train because we wanted to avoid unnecessary flights and choose a more environmentally friendly method of travel. But let's face it, you and I both know it's because I'm a train-loving masochist. Going into this journey, I wasn't expecting much. I've taken Via Rail several times and I'll link to some relevant videos in the description. But all of those previous trips were in the Windsor to Quebec City corridor on trains I've described as having all the pain of flying while taking longer than driving. And don't get me wrong, Via Rail still does some ridiculous things here in Halifax, like making people queue up to show their passports and boarding passes for a domestic train. But at least they weren't rigorously enforcing their ridiculous new baggage policy. I still can't believe they have baggage restrictions like these for a train. I sometimes wonder if Via Rail management ever, goes to other countries and realizes that they shouldn't operate a train like it's an airplane. But apart from the Via Rail airport experience, I have to admit that I actually really enjoyed taking this train. It was comfortable and enjoyable, and the staff were really friendly, but it was also very obvious at every step of the way that train service used to be so much better here. And that this train is good not because of its design, funding, or operation, but in spite of it. This is a story about an enjoyable train journey with some wonderful views, nice people, and pretty decent food. But it's also a story about the sad state of train service in Eastern Canada, and a testament to just how good train travel can be, even in a country that has done everything possible to cripple it. This train is called the Ocean. It's a sleeper train service between Montreal and Halifax. It travels along a 1,300-kilometer indirect route through eastern Canada with a scheduled travel time of just under 24 hours. There are sleeper cars with a wide variety of different sleeping options, as well as economy class seats, 2 lounge cars, a dining car, and this weird car that I'll get to later. I've heard the Ocean referred to as the second best train in Canada. The first, of course, being the Canadian, a tourist train that runs over 4,000 kilometers between Toronto and Vancouver. I would love to take this train, but to really experience it properly, I'd need to buy a prestige class ticket, and in the summer, that's nearly $7,000 per person. That's a lot. So for now, the second best train will have to do, but hey, patreon.com/notjustbikes if you want to see a video about the best one. I would normally start a video like this with a tour around the departure city, but I didn't want to spend too much time in Halifax as I find it to be a pretty forgettable city. Halifax was founded in 1749, but you'd never know it because it looks just like any other car-centric Canadian city. And I think it's gross that a city with over 500,000 people doesn't have any rapid transit at all, just buses stuck in traffic. The waterfront is enjoyable with some nice restaurants along the boardwalk, but otherwise there's really not much going on here. And the streets downtown are uncomfortably loud with so many container trucks driving through. Downtown Halifax should look like Old Montreal or Old Quebec City, but it doesn't. To me, Halifax just feels like fake London by the sea. Of course, it doesn't help that part of it was blown up in 1917, but ultimately, car infrastructure did more to destroy Halifax than the Halifax explosion did. So, needless to say, we didn't stay in Halifax while we were in Nova Scotia. Instead, we stayed in Lunenburg, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Lunenburg was founded in 1753, and it's a reasonably well-preserved example of what a typical British colonial town would have looked like at the time. There are lots of interesting wooden buildings that still retain their historic facades. The historic Anglican church is a great example of Carpenter Gothic design, and there's the historic Lunenburg Academy, with its historic surface parking lot and historic pickup trucks with historic tire spikes. On a totally unrelated note, I find it weird that almost every business has a flag that looks like the Dutch flag with the word open on it. I'm pretty sure they inherited this from the US because they do it on the East Coast there too. All in all, Lunenburg was a nice place to stay for a few days. As for Halifax, the land use around the train station is just about what you'd expect from Canada: a gas station and a giant surface parking lot attached to an oversized grocery store, with the Port of Halifax right behind that. Good price on fresh haddock fillets though. But I guess land use doesn't really matter too much because this train station is effectively no longer in use. The train to Montreal is literally the only train that departs from this station, and it only runs on 3 days of the week. So this nice historic train station is here for just 3 trains per week. The Ocean used to run 6 days per week, but these additional departures, along with hundreds of others across the country, were cancelled after Stephen Harper's Conservative Party was elected with a majority government, and they massively cut rail funding in 2012.
For years, people have been able to ride from Quebec through the Maritimes 6 days a week, but not anymore.
We will now offer 3 round trips per week instead of 6 year-round.
This year, Via Rail subsidies were cut by the Harper government by $6.5 million, another $34.7 million over the next 2 years means less trains and fewer workers.
I think it's crap.
Via Rail says that no stations will be cut due to today's announcement, but workers say that with reduced service, this is just the first stop on the Ocean Line's slow demise.
This was by far the largest reduction in service that the Ocean train had ever seen, but it was still only one of many. This train has a long history, and it's been running continuously for 120 years. It first went into service in 1905 as the Ocean Limited, operated by the Intercolonial Railway of Canada, which had the best logo of any railway company ever. Intercolonial later became Canadian Government Railways and then Canadian National, or CN, all of which were crown corporations, that is, companies owned by the Canadian government. And incidentally, yes, that's the same CN that built the CN Tower in Toronto in the 1970s. In the 1950s and 60s, the Canadian government wanted to modernize its infrastructure and started massively subsidizing the construction of highways and airports, which made it basically impossible for the passenger railway companies to compete. For CN, moving freight became significantly more profitable than moving passengers, but they were legally obligated to provide passenger service, even as other parts of the government were literally subsidizing their competition. So by the late 1960s, CN started de-marketing their passenger services, which is to say, making the service intentionally worse to drive away customers, so they could argue that there wasn't any demand for passenger rail travel in Canada, and they should be able to cancel passenger services in favor of running more freight trains. So in 1971, instead of trying to attract passengers, they spent their marketing budget on quality ads like this one promoting their freight services.
This is a container, the big new thing in freight at Canadian National. The real ones are much bigger and hold lots of freight. It's a great idea, packing a lot of things in a container so you can move them more efficiently. But really, all they had to do was ask a woman.
CN in action, building the Canadian dream.
And so began the slow decline of passenger rail in Canada. Nova Scotia, like all Canadian provinces, used to have proper passenger rail service. There even used to be a train to Lunenburg. But today, this is literally the only passenger train that operates in all of Eastern Canada. One sleeper train to Montreal 3 times per week. And yet for many of the towns along this route, this is the only public transit they have. Many of them don't even have bus service anymore. The Halifax train station is nice, so it's a bit sad that it doesn't get used more often. It's right next to a beautiful historic hotel that was built by the railway in 1930. And there's a direct connection to the hotel inside the station. There's lots of seating in the waiting area, and of course a rental car counter, because you're sure as hell not getting to or from here by public transit. After queuing up to board, a perfectly normal thing to do at any airport, we started the walk out to our train car. Halifax Station is a terminus station, and the building is at the very end of the platform, which means it's a really long walk to the start of the train. So Via Rail had golf carts that would take people to their carriage if they couldn't make the walk. And they had luggage trucks to bring people's checked baggage to the baggage car. Thankfully, our car was the one closest to the station, so we didn't need to walk very far, but we did need to hike up the stairs because Via Rail doesn't really do level boarding. When I got inside the train, I actually started second-guessing this trip because our carriage looked and felt really old. This carriage is what Via Rail calls a chateau car, and it was built by the Budd Company in Philadelphia in the 1950s. Canadian rail fans usually refer to these as HEP cars. Budd also made locomotives in the same style, and these must have looked incredible to people in the 1930s who had only ever seen steam engines. The Budd Company was unique because they made carriages out of stainless steel, and they're famous in North America because they're built like tanks and last forever. Which is how Via Rail still operates over 150 of them across Canada, even though they're 70 years old and the Budd Company went bankrupt in 2014. Once we got settled into our room and got comfortable, I remember the one benefit of older train cars. They don't build them like they used to. While our rooms were old, like really old, they were also much more spacious than most modern night trains. The seats were comfortable and they could be moved around. The rooms had a sink that also doubled as a table with a mirror and lights, and power sockets as well. And there was even an ensuite toilet. There was a temperature control knob and a fan. The room came with towels, a shower kit, as well as earplugs and water bottles. But the best part of the room, and maybe even the whole train, were these light switches. They have such a satisfying thunk that you just can't get in modern switches. Seriously, I need to buy switches like these for my next project. Does anybody make them like this anymore? Our room had lots of storage space, a closet, and these compartments by the door that were designed to store shoes. Apparently, there used to be another door on the outside so that the train attendant could shine your shoes while you were sleeping.
In the morning, the passengers sure get a surprise. Boots all shined and polished, ready for the square dance.
Because that was an expected service back in the day. These clips are from a 1965 marketing video, and it's both interesting, like how the train car that this kid is in was the exact same one my kid slept in, but also depressing to see how much better this train used to be.
But not everybody wants to retire early, least of all those in a holiday mood. For them, there's always the evening bingo game, where you can have all the fun of the fair.
Bingo game? Aw, I didn't get any bingo game. Shout out to the Winnipeg Rail fan who archived this video. If you want to see the whole thing, there's a link in the description. Of course, this was the 1960s when luxury train travel was still a big thing. And I really enjoyed this line.
I started with CN in the days of steam and smoke. And now, well, I'm glad my company didn't stay behind the times.
Little did he know he was saying this at the peak of Canadian rail passenger progress. There's a reason why these train cars are over 70 years old, because that's when Canada stopped caring about properly funding rail travel. So the rooms were old but pretty nice, though admittedly what I'm showing you are the larger rooms on the train. There were several smaller and cheaper options that I'll talk about in a bit. After we unpacked and got comfortable, the train started moving right on 10 minutes late. At the start of our journey, one of the staff members gave a short presentation about the train with some interesting facts about the railroad and a glass of sparkling wine to go with it. One of the things that was very obvious was that all of the staff on board really liked trains. I suppose you'd have to in order to take a job like this, but it was still nice. I was also fortunate enough to be on the same train as a Via Rail staff member who, you know what, I'll just let him say it.
My name's Noah. I run another YouTube channel called Noki Travels. If you're interested in more detailed information about this train in particular, I mean, you see the logo right here, you can subscribe to my channel, and I mean, appreciate Not Just Bikes for giving me this opportunity to promote my channel. It's very nice. Back to the video.
I had watched a bunch of Noah's videos when researching this trip, and they were really useful, so it was nice to recognize him on board. Definitely check out his channel if you're interested in learning more about this train or any of the other trains he's talked about. Since the presentation was in the front carriage of the train and our room was in the last carriage of the train, well, excluding the baggage car, It gave me an opportunity to film all of the other carriages before they were filled with people. The staff mentioned that this train was fully booked and later on these carriages were quite busy, so keep that in mind as I show you empty carriages throughout this video. My filming session was interrupted by an announcement that lunch was being served in the dining car. This train includes 3 meals for sleeping car passengers, lunch in Nova Scotia, dinner in New Brunswick, and finally breakfast in Quebec. The dining car was quite comfortable with proper seating and table service. For each meal, there were 3 choices of the main course, plus an additional option for fussy children. I opted for the chicken pot pie, and it was actually pretty tasty. The meals are catered and reheated on board, like on an airplane, but despite that, the food was quite good and we enjoyed every meal. In the good old days, this train used to have a chef on board, and high-quality fresh food was a selling point of the train.
Here in the Maritimes, we serve fresh salmon steak, and I mean freshly caught. Early this morning before we left. A lot of people never tasted truly fresh fish in their life until they traveled with us.
Nowadays, most night trains, especially those in Europe, are more utilitarian, with a focus on cost and convenience rather than fine dining and luxury. Which is fine, most people don't want to pay for extra luxuries on a train these days. But it definitely explains why this Via Rail service feels so strange and out of place. It's a shadow of a mid-century luxury tourist train using outdated carriages on a shoestring budget. Via Rail is a chronically underfunded organization, especially since the massive budget cuts by Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative Party in 1990, when over half of all train routes were eliminated.
So, as of January 15th, Via service will be cut in half, and more cuts could be on the way. It could have been tougher. For example, there had been plans to scrap the Atlantic run between Halifax and Montreal, but the government backed off after the plan was leaked.
So, with a highly limited budget, Via Rail needed to operate as cheaply as possible for several decades. Which is why this train looks so weird. Notice that half of the train has these 1950s stainless steel Bud Company cars that we were staying in, but the other half is made up of these significantly smaller carriages. Via Rail calls these Renaissance cars, and they look a lot more like typical European train cars, because they are. These carriages were originally built in the UK in the 1990s for a train service called Nightstar. This was a planned sleeper train service that would go between London and Amsterdam or Frankfurt through the Channel Tunnel. They even did test runs to the Netherlands. But after the rise of low-cost airlines like Ryanair and EasyJet, the Nightstar was cancelled before ever going into service. As an aside, isn't it wonderful how European airlines are artificially cheap because they aren't required to charge VAT on tickets, and they also aren't required to pay any tax on fuel, but the train companies are? Yeah, that's great. I love that. Anyway, after the cancellation of the Nightstar service, the UK needed to unload a bunch of unused and half-built night train carriages, and Via Rail was able to buy them up at fire sale prices. The Renaissance cars were designed to fit under British Railway bridges and in the Channel Tunnel, so they are much smaller than the Bud Company cars. These rooms have 2 beds, a toilet, and some have a combined toilet and shower, but if you use it, you end up with a very wet bathroom. They also have a door that can be locked by a keycard, which is nice. European sleeper train rooms are typically designed just for sleeping because you leave in the evening and arrive in the morning, which means that these rooms are small and aren't really designed for daytime comfort, which isn't ideal for a 24-hour train ride. So Via converted some of the Nightstar carriages into lounge cars, and there were 2 of them on this train on either side of the dining car. These lounges had comfortable bench seats as well as free coffee and tea. They were also the only 2 carriages on this train with Wi-Fi service. Yeah, back in the day, you used to be able to send a telegram from any carriage. Since these are European railcars, they needed to be modified in order to work with North American couplers and brakes, which is where this weird carriage comes in. Via Rail calls this the transition car. It's a nearly empty train car with European connections on one end and North American connections on the other. This is my kind of car because I also used to be Canadian and then transitioned to become European. Besides all of the equipment to bridge the 2 different carriage types, there was also this big freezer and the wall was lined with flags. The flag of Canada, and Quebec, and the various maritime provinces, including that wacky Newfoundland flag from the 80s that's actually pretty awesome. They also had this French flag with a star on it that is the flag of Acadia, which I must admit I had totally forgotten about until this trip. I also saw this depressing map that shows the handful of lines that make up what's left of the Canadian passenger rail network. And what's worse is that this map is so old that it still shows the train to Gaspé that shut down in 2013. This is definitely an unusual car to see on a train, but it's necessary when Via Rail has to cobble together a service using the carriages nobody else wants. We sat down in the dining car as the sun was setting over New Brunswick. Dinner was great, as was dessert, and we saw a heck of a lot of trees out the window. All meals on the train were included in the price of the ticket, though only for sleeping car passengers, and we were given these wristbands to identify ourselves. The sleeping cabins in the Renaissance cars are all pretty similar, but the Chateau cars have several different options for cheaper accommodations. This area of the train has the single-person roomettes, and they're staggered one high, one low to fit as many rooms in as possible. There are no doors, just curtains, and they're small rooms with just enough room for one person. They have a seat and a slide-out bed, as well as this thing that looks like a toilet, because it is, but opening it kind of makes the room look like a carpeted prison cell, so let's maybe just keep that closed and pretend it's a footrest. There are shared toilets at the ends of the carriages if you don't want to poop in your roomette. There's also a shower room, as none of the Chateau rooms have ensuite showers. The final and cheapest sleeping options are the berths. These are couches open to the rest of the train carriage during the day, but at night there are 2 bunk beds that fold down with a curtain for privacy, and ladders to reach the top bunks. In addition to the sleeping cabins, there were 2 classes of seating on this train. The stainless steel Chateau cars had standard economy in a 2x2 configuration, which looked similar to the economy class seats found on Via Rail trains in other parts of the country. And in the Renaissance cars, there was what they call comfort seating in a 2x1 configuration. These seats were wider and more comfortable with lots of legroom, so while they're obviously not as good as a bed, they would still be way better than sleeping on an airplane. The ocean train stops at 22 stations including Montreal and Halifax, but there are an additional 7 flag stops where the train will only stop if there's a passenger with a ticket to or from that station. 3 of the station stops are longer than the others, and Via Rail officially calls these service stops, but literally everyone calls them smoke stops. Back in the good old days, you used to be able to smoke on the train, but ever since those fascist health nuts started, okay, I can't even finish that joke. I guess there are some ways that this train has improved since the 1960s. Besides, when you get out to inhale some fresh air and/or tobacco smoke, you can look around and marvel at the incredible Canadian land use right next to the train station. One of the most enjoyable parts of a train trip through Canada are the views. This may not be as pretty as the mountains of Western Canada as seen on the Canadian, but it's still pretty nice. But taking in the views used to be so much nicer because this train used to have a park car, a lounge and observation car at the end of the train. And it had a dome at the top that had great views from above the rest of the train, so why was it removed? Well, in 2019, the Port of Halifax was planning an expansion to handle more cargo throughput. And to make room for extra container storage and to improve rail operations, they planned to remove this loop of track called a balloon track. This loop was originally designed for freight trains, but it wasn't being used anymore, well, except 3 times per week for the ocean train to turn around. So now, instead of turning around at Halifax, the locomotives need to move from one end of the train to the other, which is why this train has 2 locomotives, one of them facing forwards and one of them facing backwards. But since the park cars were originally designed to go only at the end of the train, Via Rail decided to remove them from the end of the ocean trains rather than to try to modify them. The one silver lining is that the port expansion project is supposed to significantly reduce the amount of container truck traffic through downtown Halifax, so that's nice. Incidentally, if you're curious as to why it's called a park car, it's because they're all named after Canadian parks. Via Rail has another dome carriage called the Skyline car that is designed to go in the middle of the train, but these can't be used on the ocean train because the Skyline cars are now so old that several of them had to be scrapped and there aren't enough to go around anymore. And so the slow decline of Canadian passenger rail continues. After sunset, the staff came around to bring down the beds in the sleeper cabins and we got ready to go to sleep. The bed was really comfortable, but I still had some trouble getting to sleep, so I put on some space facts to fall asleep to and drifted off to the soothing voice of John Michael Gaudier.
The main star system itself is called Alpha Centauri, which is really 2 stars. These stars are quite famous, but oddly, they usually aren't.
And in the end, I had a decent sleep. The bed was good and I didn't hear any noise from any of the adjacent cabins. The biggest issue was that this train rocked around a lot, even when it wasn't going very fast, but I can't really blame Via Rail for that because it all comes down to the horrific quality of the tracks. After years of de-marketing, the quality of passenger rail in Canada was declining rapidly, so in 1977 the government decided to split Canadian National in two. CN would be responsible only for freight traffic, and a new company, Via Rail, would be responsible for passenger rail. But importantly, CN retained ownership of all the tracks. This was probably fine when both companies were crown corporations, but in 1995 the Canadian government sold off CN, and it became a private corporation listed on the stock market. Which means that today, the vast majority of train tracks in Canada are owned by private freight rail companies. This is drastically different from most other countries where, just like with the roads and highways, the government owns the rails. For example, here in the Netherlands, the rails are owned by ProRail, a government organization responsible for the maintenance and construction of railway infrastructure. Their YouTube channel is interesting, with dozens of videos and live streams of construction and maintenance projects they're working on. So in most other countries, the government ensures that their railway infrastructure is kept in good condition. But in Canada, CN doesn't give a fuck. Track maintenance is expensive and cuts into profits, so as the quality of the track degrades, it's cheaper to just impose speed restrictions rather than to improve the track. For a freight train carrying bulk cargo, it's more important to carry lots of stuff rather than to carry it quickly, so the speed restrictions are mostly irrelevant to CN unless it's a particularly busy freight corridor. Which means that Via Rail has to suffer, and when we traveled, the speed restrictions were even lower than usual due to a heat wave. There are some parts of the route where the speeds are painfully slow, especially off the main line. Some parts of the Newcastle subdivision have a 10-mile-per-hour speed limit. But it gets worse because a lot of this route is single track, which means that trains will often need to stop on a siding to let another train pass. In the US, freight trains are required by law to yield to passenger trains, but no such law exists in Canada. But to be honest, laws like that are basically useless because the old passing sidings can only hold about 75 train cars. Meanwhile, freight trains are much longer than they used to be, usually over 150 cars long. So the freight trains couldn't fit on the sidings anyway, even if the law said they'd have to. And of course, CN isn't going to spend a dime making those passing tracks longer, so when a freight train is coming in the opposite direction, Via Rail needs to wait. All of this means that this train is slower today than it has ever been, so it's a good thing it's comfortable. You definitely don't take a train like this for the speed of travel. This is a trip where the journey itself is part of the enjoyment. And speaking of which, breakfast was great. The weather was clear and there were some nice views of Quebec. And we were actually moving at a reasonable speed too, because this segment is one of the most profitable rail lines in Canada, for freight trains of course. Unfortunately, because of the speed restrictions and freight trains in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, we were still running far behind schedule. But on the bright side, it meant we had more time to enjoy the views. And we slowly pulled into Montreal, about 2.5 hours behind schedule. My favorite thing about the Montreal Via Rail station is that they have proper high platforms, proving that Via Rail can actually do level boarding. But they can't do this at most other stations because high platforms would interfere with wide freight cars. And the rails through most stations are owned by the freight train companies because, of course they are. As I stood enjoying a Montreal bagel and watching people line up like they're at the airport, I started to wonder, would I recommend this train to others? And I think the answer is, if you enjoy trains, then yes, you should take this train at least once. It's definitely best to check the latest off-peak pricing though, as it's really expensive in the summer. Since departures were cut from 6 days per week to 3, Fixed costs to operate the train have stayed the same, but there's now significantly lower ridership, so it's extremely hard for Via Rail to make any money off of this train. The cost savings promised by the Conservative government have never materialized, and Via Rail needs to make up the shortfall through higher ticket prices. As usual, if you're planning to book this train or really any train trip, you should check out the relevant page on The Man in Seat 61. I'll leave a link in the description. I've heard rumor that this train will be funded for at least the next 10 years, but what it will look like is anybody's guess. It doesn't look like the Ocean will ever get its dome car back, and the carriages aren't getting any younger. For example, it's just as well we took this train when we did, because the very next departure, 2 days later, experienced a mechanical failure just outside of Halifax, and all passengers needed to use replacement buses for basically the entire journey. Ironically, it's the Renaissance cars from the 90s that will be replaced first, as they are reaching the end of their service life. They were never designed for Canadian weather, and many of them have already been taken out of service on other routes. So by about 2030, Via Rail needs to find a solution if they want to keep this train operating. Canada currently has a Liberal government that has promised to increase funding for Via Rail, but they've been slow to deliver on that promise, and there's still no clear plan as to what comes next when the Renaissance cars are no longer functional. But no matter what happens, there's one thing we know for sure. In the distant future, when the CN Tower has fallen, people will still be riding around in what is left of Canada in Bud Company stainless steel train carriages. After Montreal, we continued our trip to Toronto and eventually even made it to fake London, though our 2-hour train arrived over an hour late. Thanks, CN. I had planned to make another video about my public transit journey through Canada by traveling all the way to the beach at Grand Bend, but that did not go according to plan, and I had to take a 50-minute taxi instead. So that trip was, interesting, but the video of that failed trip will not perform well on YouTube, so I'm making it available only on Nebula. I'll put a link in the description. If you'd like to support this channel and the work I do so that I can keep riding trains for your entertainment, then the best way to do that is by signing up to Nebula. Because when you sign up to Nebula, you'll support this channel, but you'll also get access to the videos of over 200 other talented creators, all without any ads or sponsorships. And there's a growing library of Nebula Originals videos that are only available on Nebula. But perhaps my favorite thing about Nebula is that it's a creator-owned streaming service. It's not owned by venture capital firms, media conglomerates, or big tech. And it's not beholden to the whims of advertisers either. Which is why Nebula can support creators and provide a platform for them to make the videos they want to make without worrying about demonetization or algorithmic optimization. If you'd like to support a creator-owned streaming service and get access to some great videos in the process, then I'd encourage you to try Nebula. If you sign up at the link go.nebula.tv/notjustbikes, you'll get 40% off an annual subscription, and you'll financially support this channel in the process. Thanks to everyone who supports this channel on Nebula, on Patreon, or even you right now by watching this video on YouTube through to the end. I appreciate it.